Realm presents The Vela Salvation, Episode 6.
Asala seethed. It wasn't exactly an unfamiliar feeling, but it had been a while since she had felt it this fiercely. Salvation, or whatever the hell the ground folks had taken to calling this planet, was shaping up to be anything but. The heat of the twin suns beat down on the jeep as it rumbled across miles of pastel purple grassland. Far ahead were the shadows of the mountains, and just before that, a lush forest in shades of amethyst, lavender, aubergine. Romantic words for romantic colors, Asala thought bitterly. The kind children painted their imaginary worlds in. This world looked like one of those childhood fantasies, but Asala had only been here 2 days, and she had already seen the ugliness lurking beneath the illusion of a pastel paradise. Teeth clenched. She took a deep breath of luxuriously fresh, clean air and reminded herself why she was here. Because this world wasn't paradise, but it was hope. It was a future for her, for Dio, and damned if she was going to let looters in the dark take that away from them. Drink? A voice from the front of the jeep caught her attention. Asala accepted the canteen of water gratefully, drank deeply, and handed it back to the man in the passenger seat. Jude was a tall, thin, pale man in his 50s, a botanist who had only explored the grasslands around the ground camp so far, but he wanted to see the native flora of the forest and mountains. Neve, who had insisted on accompanying Asala as well, was driving the jeep. "We should hit the forest in 20 miles or so," she said, and smiled slightly over her shoulder at Asala. It was a tight, nervous smile, a smile that knew the risks of this expedition. Neve had tried to talk Asala out of it, and when she failed, she sighed and said, "We'll leave in the morning then." The fourth and final member of their expedition team was Oba, the young scientist who had been wounded in the attack the night before. Asala had tried to protest when he offered to come along, but he had only grinned and said he'd had worse. "And as one of the few scientists who knows how to shoot," he added cheerfully, "I reckon you could use me." Now, 4 or 5 hours into the trip, Asala still wasn't sure if she was glad Oba had come along. He had barely stopped talking since they set off, about his work, about the strange white deer they had seen across the grassland, about his life in Kaim, about the God's damn clouds in the sky. And it was at once maddening and soothing. There was something about his guileless, relentless niceness that reminded Asala of Nico. She couldn't decide if that was a good thing or not. It was comforting, but it also hurt more than she wanted to admit. Asala and Oba were in the back seat of the jeep, with the raider from last night wedged between them. His hands were still bound behind his back, and he had his jacket zipped all the way up to his neck, which had to be uncomfortable in the full warmth of the day. But Asala couldn't bring herself to care. All she cared about was that he continued to point them the right way. So far, he had. Everywhere their jeep went, Asala could see signs that other vehicles had been there before them. Flattened grass, tire grooves in the ground, places where fallen branches or overgrown shrubs had been cut back with the clean line of a knife, rather than the jagged edges an animal's teeth would leave behind, that kind of thing. On a planet that had been untouched by human life before the ground camp arrived, only the people who had defected to this other mysterious camp could have left such signs of their presence behind. "You look familiar," Oba was saying now to the looter. "We must have seen each other around camp before you guys left." The looter blinked slowly, as if the question had brought him back from somewhere else. Gray eyes turned to Oba. "I remember you," he said. "You used to drink with a bunch of us in the mess tent. Drank everyone else under the table, too. Oba said proudly. His teeth flashed in a smile, and it actually looked sincere. Remarkable. The looter, or at least one of his companions, had shot Oba just the night before, and yet here Oba was, smiling at him. Look, you've cooperated since we left camp, so I'm gonna untie your hands. Jude, give me the canteen for a sec. Jude grunted annoyance, but complied. After all, none of them wanted their guide to die of thirst. Asala kept her arm cannon pointed at the looter as he flexed his free hands, wiggling his fingers to get some feeling back. But he didn't so much as glance at it. He thanked Oba as he took the canteen. When he was finished, he leaned back. His eyes drifted out the window again. Her lips set in a line. Asala turned away. She couldn't quite put her finger on why, but the looter unsettled her. Was it that faraway look on his face? Was it because he hadn't complained once the whole time they'd been in the Jeep, in spite of the heat, the discomfort of having his hands bound behind his back for hours, the weapon pointed at him? Or was it because he'd given them the directions they asked for and hadn't tried to lead them astray even once? In Asala's experience, prisoners weren't usually this calm, polite, or cooperative. For the first time, she wondered if this was a mistake. What's your field? Oba asked the looter now, handing the canteen back to Jude in the front. He absently dusted off his hands, and fine red dust scattered to the floor of the Jeep. The looter's gaze didn't waver from the horizon as he said, Mycology? Mycology? That was Asala. The study of fungi, Neve explained. Spores and the like. Asala grimaced. Riveting. The scientists laughed. Grinning at her, Oba said, So what gets you excited then? A future with my sister, she almost said. She stopped herself in time. These people were not her friends. Instead, she said, Staying alive. Neve tisked, and Oba said, What good is alive if you're not living? Asala didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't in the Jeep anymore. Asala, a voice said. Startled, Asala turned. Nico stood behind her, their eyes wide and imploring. How am I here? She demanded. Hadn't she been in the Jeep just moments before? How are you here? I left you behind. I followed you, they replied. The smallest of smiles twitched her mouth. You've got more guts than I gave you credit for, kid. Nico's answering smile was brief, but there. They remembered. She'd said it to them back on Kayam, before everything. I'm glad you're here, she said. I'm glad you came. She held her arms out to hug them, to show them how relieved and happy she was that one of the worst things she'd done had been undone. But when she touched them, when Nico touched her, they crumbled into red ash. Crimson dust slipped through her fingers, crimson like blood. And Asala cried out in horror. She stumbled back. But Nico was gone. And the red ash was everywhere. It was everywhere. And she choked on it, breathed it, became it. Asala! Asala's eyes flew open. She was in the Jeep. Her cheek hurt like all hell. Jude was behind the wheel of the Jeep instead of Neve. And the suns were low in the sky. Had she fallen asleep? Had she been asleep so long that afternoon had turned into evening? The Jeep had come to a halt. Everyone was staring at her. Jude looked uneasy, Neve anxious, and Oba, who was leaning over the prisoner toward Asala, looked sheepish. Asala put a hand to her stinging cheek. Oh. Sorry, Oba said. You were having a nightmare and shouting at you didn't work. Asala didn't reply at once. There was something on her hand, a dark reddish moss that must have fallen off a shrub they'd driven by as she slept. She brushed it off and tried to even out her breathing. Nico. That too brief smile, her joy, the hug. Nico crumbling to ash, the horror, the ash swallowing her up. She swallowed, nauseated. For a precious few moments, she had been so sure that Nico had really been there. For a precious few moments, the guilt and grief she spent all her time ignoring had been lifted away. And then, like all the good things in Asala's life, it had crumbled. Gritting her teeth, she said, I fell asleep, and none of you thought to wake me sooner? Everything was fine, said Niamh reasonably. You obviously needed the rest, so we thought there'd be no harm and... No harm? Asala snapped. We're in a confined vehicle with the man who was shooting at us just last night, a man who is no longer tied up, by the way, and I'm the only trained soldier here. I have some training, Oba objected. Asala cut him a sharp look. Where? Kayami mercenaries, he replied, and then he was off, cheerfully recounting the story of how he had been in the middle of a scientific project when he was kidnapped by mercenaries who had mistaken him for someone else. By the time they realized their error, he had been with them for a few weeks and had picked up a few new skills. Before Oba could finish this riveting and, in Asala's opinion, entirely fictional tale, the looter spoke up, surprising everyone into silence. I'm not gonna try to hurt any of you, he said. Now that we've come this far, we might as well go the rest of the way. I think you should come see our camp. I want you to see... He stopped abruptly, as if he had said more than he meant to. Asala narrowed her eyes at him. Why? She demanded. You must know that once we find your camp, we'll take back the equipment and loot you've stolen. And if there's a fight, you or your friends may die. Why are you willing to risk that? Well, maybe you won't take it all back, the looter replied. Maybe there won't be a fight. Maybe you'll understand why we left once you see. See what? But he looked away and didn't answer. He scratched absently at his neck, where Asala could see he'd made the skin red and sore. After a long, tense silence, during which Asala glowered at everyone and Niamh chewed worriedly on her bottom lip, Jude revved the jeep back to life. We should get to the forest, he said curtly. Better to have some cover when we stop for the night. They cuffed one of the looters' wrists to the inner door handle of the jeep. Oba protested this as unnecessary, but Asala wasn't taking any chances, no matter how many times the looter claimed he wanted to take them to his camp. He didn't complain. He curled up quietly, docilely, and closed his eyes. Asala was pretty sure he was awake, though, because she could hear him murmuring quietly. Maybe he was the praying kind. Or maybe he was talking to himself. The forest rose up around them, dense and whispery, the fluttering purple leaves glittering so dark that they were almost black in the night. The jeep, which ran on solar energy, still had some juice, but they needed to conserve it, so they had stopped a couple of miles into the forest to make camp. Niamh and Jude had both ducked into the trees to relieve themselves, but Asala's priority was making sure the looter was secure. Oba set a solar lamp down on a smooth boulder a few feet away from the jeep, providing a small pool of light, and they sat around it to eat. Dinner was a nutrient bar and strips of dried meat. Not as fresh or delicious as the previous night's dinner, but still a fucking sight better than most of the rations Asala had consumed in her time. She ate ravenously, but didn't speak much and kept her hearing implants dialed all the way up. If their prisoner so much as sneezed, she wanted to know it. Besides, this new world had to have native predators, and those predators might well come sniffing around. "I can take first watch," Niev offered when they'd finished eating. Masala shook her head. "No, you drove most of the day. I'll do it." She didn't add that she didn't trust any of them to keep watch. It wasn't their fault. They were scientists, not soldiers, no matter what Oba said. Better they each stuck to what they knew best. Niev fetched her sleep pod from the Jeep's trunk, inflated it, and was asleep in moments. Masala almost envied that. Jude was crouched on the ground, scraping samples of soil and leaves into the tubes he'd brought with him, but soon he, too, retired to his own sleep pod. Oba, who showed no indication whatsoever that he was tired, stayed by the lamp with Asala. "We're lucky it's going to be a clear night," he said. "You haven't experienced rainfall here yet, have you?" "Only briefly. Should I be concerned?" "It's acidic," he said. "Not enough to burn, but it stings. Best to stay out of it if you can. We shouldn't have to worry about it over the next couple of days, though. Based on the patterns I've observed over the last few months, there's always a distinct uptick in moisture in the air for a few days before it rains. And there's been no sign of that yet." "You're a climatologist, right?" Asala said. "That's why you volunteered to come down from orbit in the first wave? To study the weather patterns?" Oba grinned. "Hell no. I volunteered for the adventure. In 100 years, when we've established our cities and new generations have lived their whole lives here, they'll remember the names of those of us who came first. Sure, I'd like to be remembered for my brilliant work in climatology, but it'd be even cooler to be remembered as an adventurer, don't you think?" His eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. It was so utterly without artifice, so open and infectious, that, in spite of herself, Asala found herself smiling back. "You'll be remembered, kid," she said. "Maybe you'll even get a statue. Wouldn't that be something?" "So," she went on, "how did you really learn how to shoot?" Oba's smile faltered. "What makes you think the story I told you wasn't true?" She raised one eyebrow. Shadows flickered in and out of his eyes. "They were mercenaries," he said at last. "But I wasn't in the middle of a project. I was 6 years old, and they were recruiting child soldiers. I escaped when I was 10. He looked down at his hands. "I don't remember most of it, but I guess some things don't leave you. I will never forget how to shoot." Asala's gut clenched, but she said quietly, "I'm sorry that happened to you." She paused. "Even after that, you still came here for glory and adventure?" "They took 4 years of my life," Oba said, the bright flare of his smile flashing again. "Hell, if I was gonna let them kick all the spirit out of me, too." That... Before she could finish, they were interrupted. A strangled yell came from inside Jude's pod. Asala was already halfway there, arm cannon aimed and ready, when Jude burst out of the pod, blue eyes wild. "Give me that!" he snapped. "Absolutely not!" Asala snapped back. "What's gotten into you?" He glared at her, then turned. His head whipped from side to side as he searched the trees. "Where is she? Is she here?" Asala clenched her hand around her weapon. "Is who here?" "Maru?" Jude said, but he didn't say it like he was answering her. He said it like a question. "Maru, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry." Niev crawled out of her sleep pod, hair a big red mess. "What the hell is going on out here?" "Did you see her?" Jude demanded. "Did she speak to you?" "Who?" "Maru!" he shouted. "Who else?" Niev paled, her freckled skin almost translucent in the dim lamplight. "Maru was his research partner," she whispered to Asala and Oba. "She died on Kym. He never told me much more than that." "Do we think he's sleepwalking?" Oba asked. Do I have to slap him awake too? Asala took a step closer to Jude. He spun around to face her, but relaxed when he realized that it was her and not whatever figment of his imagination had caused him such horror. Maru's not here, she said sharply. Snap out of it. Jude blinked once, twice. Slowly, he seemed to come back to himself. His breathing slowed, and he sat abruptly down on the boulder. No, of course she's not here, he said, more quietly. I apologize. I don't know what came over me. Here, Niev said gently, handing him a canteen. Something hot to drink. Oh, she added in surprise, you've got something on your arm. You must have put your paw down on a patch of moss. Looking closer, Asala saw that Jude's forearm was a bright, glittering red. The moss, or whatever it was almost glowing. It looked like sparkling red mushrooms had grown out of Jude's skin. But when he brushed a hand carefully down his arm, they crumbled and fell away like dust. Instantly, Jude's face snapped into an expression of fascination. Remarkable, he said. It's a fungus of some kind. We've seen something like this back at camp, haven't we, Niev? Those reddish, mushroomy spores we keep having to scrape off our walls and equipment? She asked. Yes, this does look the same. I don't remember seeing the spores back at camp glow like this, though. Perhaps this is a different variant of the same species, Jude said. Different terrain, different stimuli. I'd have to study it closer, of course. Where did I put my sample tubes? Niev went back to her pod. After making sure Asala really didn't mind taking the first watch, Oba followed suit. Asala sat back down by the solar lamp and watched Jude collect his sample. What did you do to her? She asked. He glanced up distracted. What? Maru, your research partner. What did you do to her? You said you were sorry. Jude's face shuddered. I didn't do anything to her, he said flatly, and strode back to his pod, a sample tube clutched in one very tightly clenched fist. It was a lie, of course, but Asala didn't care enough to pursue it. Jude wasn't the only one who dreamed of the trail of wrongs he'd left in his wake. So she turned away from him and looked up at the sky instead, splattered with stars, and imagined she could see Dio's ship. Soon, she told herself, soon she'd get to the defectors' camp, get her cargo back, and put the future she had fought so hard for back on track. Soon. In the morning, small round mushrooms of red fungus had bloomed over parts of the jeep. As Asala brushed them off, she couldn't help noticing that most of it seemed to be on the inside. Asala had been awake all night, so she slept in fits and starts in the jeep. Each time she did, war raged in her dreams. Gunfire, exploding ships, the screams of the wounded. She had lived and breathed war for so long that these dreams were familiar. But there was something new now, something in the corners of the dreams, a shadow that hadn't been there before. When she turned to face it, to confront the shadow that had crept up on her, the dream shifted. Suddenly she was with Dio in the snow, or she was killing Ekram all over again, or Nico was crumbling into ash. Each time, she woke with her body all locked up and her hand clenched around her weapon. If she kept this up, she was going to end up shooting someone. She started letting Oba hold her arm cannon while she slept. That night, Niev didn't sit with them to eat. She retired early to her pod, but she wasn't asleep. They could hear her whispering quietly. Once they even heard her laugh. Jude didn't sleep. He said he wasn't tired, but Asala could tell he was afraid. In the jeep the next day, as she drove, Niamh was in a good mood. Asala even heard her humming. Oba sang along. "Is there a reason for these high spirits?" Asala asked. Niamh smiled at her. "My mother died 2 years ago," she said. "It's hurt every single day since then. But for some reason, it doesn't hurt today." "Look," Jude said suddenly, distracting them. "The deer." They passed a small herd of white deer, stark and pale against the purples of the forest. They were all dead. "Do you think their water source was poisoned?" Oba asked Jude. Before Jude could reply, their prisoner let out a sharp, unexpected laugh. "It's not the water that's killing them." The day after that, Oba didn't sing. By dusk, he was barely even speaking. "We'll be there in 2 days," the looter said as the jeep left the forest behind and started up a rocky, uneven mountain road. Asala noticed the red sore patches on his neck had crept all the way up to his jaw. She caught herself wishing they had never come. In the dream, she tried once again to confront the shadow in the corners, the thing that kept out of sight yet never went away. And once again, when she turned to face it, the dream changed. Nico was there, and then they weren't, because they had burst into clouds of thick, moist red ash. Asala choked and spluttered, but it was too late. She'd already breathed it in. It was inside her, and she was inside it, and she wasn't sure which was which anymore. Horror and guilt and grief and terror rose up inside her. She could hear the screams of the war-wounded and see Ekram's desperate eyes. And Nico, poor Nico, was ash in her arms. It was too much of everything. And still she fought because she had to break free. She had to get the ash out. She woke with her jaw locked tight and her right hand clenched into a fist. It was just dumb luck she hadn't been holding her arm cannon when she fell asleep. On their 4th night on the road, as they searched the winding mountain track for somewhere to make camp, the looter spoke up again. "There's a spring about a mile from here," he told them. "There's fresh water and fruit that's safe to eat. It would be a good place to set up camp for the night." "No one asked you," Jude said gruffly, but it was a half-hearted objection. With a small smile, Niamh drove to the spring. "You'll like it there," she said to the others with certainty. "You said that like you've been there before," Asala said. "Of course I haven't," Niamh replied, and said nothing more about it. Oba, who had been looking quietly out the jeep window, caught Asala's eye. It was brief, so Asala couldn't be sure, but she rather thought he looked afraid. At first, when they got to the spring and saw the clear water, the ripe pink fruit on the purple trees, and the soft, cushiony vegetation on the ground, it was blissful. Even Asala, who refused to let her guard down for as much as a moment, found herself almost enchanted. It was dark, with no moon above, but there was just enough starlight to see the shimmer of the fruit, the sparkle of the water, the dark softness underfoot. When they got out of the jeep, it felt like they were walking on clouds. The cool, fresh water was one of the best things Asala had tasted in her life. For an hour or so, everyone was in good spirits. Jude's bags bulged with samples. Niamh sat dreamily on a rock, with her toes trailing in the water like a child, and Oba's chatter filled the spaces again. The prisoner stayed in the jeep like he did every night, cuffed. Asala was not about to budge on that point. She lay on a rock a few feet away from Niamh, staring at the sky and wishing with all her heart that Dio had come down here with her. This was the kind of place she had dreamed of making a home for them in. Here, with only the basest of technology, with no war, with no gunfire or death or wormholes, she could imagine a future. She could imagine herself feeling something like happiness. But Dio hadn't come, because Dio wanted more than a sister. She wanted her wife. She wanted the life she'd had before. And Nico, well, Asala had left Nico behind. I'm always going to be alone. The thought was so bleak and so unlike her that she jolted upright and shook herself like she could somehow shake away the insidious loneliness that had crept inside her. I'm going to take a bath, she announced. Oba, will you hold on to my arm cannon until I'm out? Tall trees with long lavender fronds lined the edges of the spring, which gave her a modicum of privacy. She bathed quickly and efficiently. The longer she spent away from her weapon, the edgier she felt. Shaking water off her close-cropped hair, Asala approached Oba, who was sitting alone on a fallen log by the jeep, and sat down beside him. He handed back her arm cannon. The smile he gave her was smaller and older than the one she had, against her better judgment, grown fond of. Where are Jude and Neve? Pods, Oba said. Asala studied him for a moment. You okay, kid? He grinned, but it was all crooked. A grin that didn't know it was supposed to be a grin. It collapsed almost immediately. No, he admitted. What's wrong with us? Nothing feels right. None of us feels right. Do we feel right to you? No, Asala said slowly. Something's happening to us, but I can't figure out what it is. Is it something in the air we are breathing? Some kind of poisonous fume released by a plant? If that was the case, we'd all have similar symptoms. Oba pointed out, ever the scientist. Toxins tend to be consistent, but there's nothing consistent about the way we've all been behaving. Asala glanced behind them at the jeep. What about him? He's barely said 2 sentences to us since we left base camp, Oba said. He sounded hollow, like all the merriment and joy had been plucked out of him. I don't think we can hold him responsible for this. He took a deep, shuddering breath and let it out again. I think I'm gonna turn in. Asala watched him go. Her eyes felt heavy, most likely from days of broken sleep and travel, so she rose to her feet, strapped her arm cannon in place, and decided to scout the perimeter of their camp. It was a simple, soothing routine, and it kept her moving. She checked the prisoner first, whispering to himself on the back seat. Then she cleaned some of that red mushroom moss off the jeep. Then she paused outside each of the scientists' sleep pods. Neve was whispering, Jude snoring, and Oba completely silent. Then she did a circuit of the spring and the fruit trees, collecting fruit to store for later, refilling canteens, keeping an eye out for predators. There was not much else to do after that, and so reluctantly, Asala sat down and fell asleep almost at once. She knew she was asleep because Nico was here, and she knew by now that they were never really here. Still, she smiled at them. Still, she said, "You've got more guts than I gave you credit for, kid." Still, she tried to put her arms around them. And still, she was horrified when they crumbled into red ash. Like flowers, like mushrooms, the ash bloomed on and around her. Her arms were full of it, the air thick with it. It crawled up her skin, it slipped down her throat. She cried out, but she'd breathed it in and it was inside her. Now she was ash too. And she wasn't afraid anymore. No, she actually felt okay. Better than okay. She felt right. She felt good. At long last, she wasn't alone anymore. Gunfire woke her, the sound slamming into her implants. She tried to lurch to her feet, but she was locked up, frozen in place. A silent scream built in her throat as she tried and failed to move. It was her gun going off. She knew it because she could feel her hand clenched over the trigger. She had fallen asleep with it in her hand, and now, like she had feared for days, it had gone off. As the awful, terrifying paralysis wore off, she stumbled upright and let her weapon fall to the ground. Something soft and spongy fell off her hand at the same time, but she didn't have time to take a closer look. Somewhere close by, she could hear someone crying out. What had she shot at in her sleep? Who had she hurt? In the starlight, she could see shadows moving on the ground. Neve was crying out. That was her on the ground, her strangled cries. And there was someone on top of her. Asala stumbled toward them and saw to her mingled horror and relief that she hadn't shot anyone. Neve was on the ground and crying out because Jude had his hands around her throat. "Jude!" Asala barked. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice came out on a sob. "She won't leave me alone. She won't leave me alone. I have to make her stop." Asala seized him by the shoulder. He tried to fight back, but he was no match for her. She slammed her boot into the inside of his elbow, forcing him to release Neve with a yelp of pain, and dragged him away from the woman on the ground. Neve rolled away at once, gasping for breath. "Stop!" Jude cried. "I have to make her go away, don't you see? I have to make her stop looking at me like that. Whatever the hell you did to Maru, deal with it on your own time," Asala snapped at him. He stared at her, his eyes full of some nameless terror. And guilt. Asala knew guilt, and she could see it all over him. Taking pity on him, she kept her voice calm and slow as she said, "You're still asleep, Jude. That's Neve, not Maru. Enough now." Jude wrenched himself away from her, but he didn't go after Neve again. He curled up on the ground, sobbing. Several feet away, Neve wrapped her arms around her knees, squeezed her eyes shut, and rocked herself gently. Asala kept one eye on them as she checked on their prisoner, who was still awake and lying quietly on the back seat. There was no sign of Oba, which was a whole other thing to worry about, because the gunfire and shouting should have woken him up. There was no question that something had gone very wrong out here, but Asala didn't have the first idea how to fix it. This was way above her pay grade. How was she supposed to fight an enemy she couldn't even identify? One thing at a time. First, she had to make sure Jude didn't have another episode and go after Neve or any of the rest of them again. She couldn't trust him. She couldn't trust any of them. You can't trust yourself either, a tiny voice at the back of her mind reminded her. Only one of you fired a weapon in the sleep. Jaw clenched. She ignored it. She fetched a cuff from the jeep and went back to where Jude lay curled into a tight ball on the ground. He had sobbed himself back to sleep. Feeling slightly guilty, Asala bound his hands behind his back. He didn't stir. "Neve, you good?" she called across the camp. Neve didn't open her eyes, but she nodded. Two down. Asala went to Oba's sleep pod and tapped on the door. When there was no answer, she unzipped it and stuck her head inside. Startled, she saw that Oba was awake. He was sitting up, and his eyes were closed, but his hands were clamped over his ears, and he kept jerking his head from side to side. "Oba," Asala said quietly, "what are you doing?" "Too loud," he whispered. "Too loud." Guilt dropped a heavy weight into Asala's belly, but she said, "It's over. Jude and Neve are fine. The gunfire was an accident. Everything's okay." Oba didn't lower his hands, but he opened his eyes. "It's so loud," he choked out. "Still?" Asala asked, unnerved. "I can't hear anything." "What's happening to me?" "I don't know," she said. She used her soldier voice, brusque and clipped, to hide her own fear. "I'm going to need you to come outside, okay? I need to keep an eye on everyone." Dawn wasn't far off, but she wasn't sure that was much of a comfort. It didn't seem to matter whether it was day or night. Their demons seemed to be able to find them no matter what. Oba crawled out of his pod, bringing his blanket with him, and found a spot outside to sit with it wrapped around him. Jude was still asleep and still bound, and Neve hadn't budged from her own spot on the ground. She had opened her eyes and was looking out past the edge of the mountainside, where the star-speckled sky seemed to go on forever. She seemed calmer, even peaceful. Asala went back to the spot where she had dropped her arm cannon. It took her a few minutes to find it in the dark. She retrieved it, hating how unsure and tentative she felt, and tucked it away into its slot at once. It had never felt so dangerous in her hands. After that, there was nothing left to do but wait and watch. It could have been a few minutes, or it could have been an hour. But at some point, Asala jerked out of a near sleep to the sound of the prisoner's voice from the jeep. "Do you mind if I bathe?" Asala opened her mouth to tell him he could have picked his timing better, then shut it again. The scientists were quiet. Jude was still asleep. Was there really any harm in letting the looter get several days of filth off him? If nothing else, getting him to the spring and keeping an eye on him would keep her busy for a little while. "Fine," she replied. "Try anything, and I put my knife in your eye, understood?" "That's been pretty obvious to me from the moment we met, ma'am." Asala would have suspected him of cheek if his tone hadn't been so scrupulously polite. So she said nothing. Instead, she went over to Oba and put her arm cannon on the ground beside him. "Keep an eye on it for me, kid." He had his hands clamped over his ears again and kept taking deep, shuddering breaths, but he nodded. Asala hoped like hell that this wouldn't be the moment when a predator chose to investigate their camp. She didn't think Oba was in any fit state to pick the weapon up and defend himself. She would take it to the spring with her, except she didn't want to risk it. She was so on edge that she suspected that if the prisoner so much as dared to scratch his nose the wrong way, she'd shoot him. And then what would have been the point of all this? She uncuffed the looter from the jeep door handle and motioned him over to the stream. He walked ahead of her on legs that were somewhat wobbly from lack of use over the past few days, his clothes stiff with sweat and dirt. Gods, he stank. They probably all had before they arrived at the spring. As they approached the water, Asala took a chance and asked the looter a question. What's wrong with him? With all of us, she thought, but didn't correct herself. What makes you think there's something wrong with them? He replied. Maybe this is simply the fire they have to survive in order to become phoenixes. Asala wished she hadn't asked. What the hell was that supposed to mean? On the other hand, maybe it was a good thing she'd asked. His answer told her something she hadn't quite clocked until now. He didn't seem at all surprised by anything he had seen. Maybe he'd even expected this. Oba had rationalized that the prisoner couldn't possibly be responsible for what was happening to any of them. But Asala was becoming more and more convinced that he had to be. If nothing else, he had the answers. Asala set her jaw. She needed to make him talk. Maybe there were answers waiting at the defectors' camp, but she wasn't sure they'd make it that long. The looter stripped his boots and jacket off, then glanced at her as if to ask for privacy. She snorted. "Not a chance," she said. "Don't worry, it's nothing I haven't seen before." His laugh came out of the blue, a deep, jagged sound, with an edge of hysteria. The sound chilled Asala to the bone. She understood why he'd laughed as he stripped his shirt off and started to step into the spring. The red sore patches she'd noticed on his neck over the past few days extended all the way down his back. What was wrong with his skin? Had he been wounded? Asala took a step closer, squinting, and saw that it wasn't a wound at all. "Hold on a minute," she ordered, snatching up his filthy shirt and following him to the water. "Your back is covered in that red fungus we saw earlier. It needs to be scraped off before you..." He froze as soon as she touched his back with the shirt wrapped around her fist like a glove, as if in shock. But the moment she started to wipe the fungus off, he jerked around like he had been electrocuted. "No!" he burst out, his voice cracking in anguish. "You can't! Give it back!" He lashed out. Asala could tell it was a reflex, but she had no intention of letting him hurt her accidentally or otherwise. The shirt plunked into the water as she ducked and threw her weight against his legs. They fell backward, half in the water and half out, and the looter let out a howl as more of the fungus on his back came away under Asala's scrabbling fingers. His fist landed square in her belly, forcing the air out of her lungs, and she growled, more in irritation than in pain. It had been a long damn night, and she had had enough of all of them. She slammed her elbow into his face. He reeled, hands flying to his bloody nose. Taking advantage of his distraction, she wrapped a strong, efficient arm around his neck and squeezed until she felt him lose consciousness. Then she let his limp body drop to the ground. It seemed the time she'd spent bathing had been wasted. She was pretty sure she was filthier now than she had been before they'd stopped here for the night. But there was some good news. She could see the first splash of pale light on the horizon. The suns would be up in minutes. Daylight wouldn't get rid of whatever had climbed into them and turned them all inside out. But at least it would be easier to see what the hell was going on around her. And then, just as she allowed herself a moment of optimism, the sound of Neve's horrified cry shattered it. Not again. She spun around, but Jude was still fast asleep on the ground. Neve hadn't moved either, but her face was deathly white. "Oba, please," she begged. "Put it down. Please." Asala's heart thumped painfully against her ribs as she saw the source of Neve's terror. Oba was on his feet, eyes shut, one hand pressed to one ear, the other hand closed tightly around Asala's arm cannon. He had it pressed to his own temple. Asala's training kicked in. "Hand it over, kid," she said firmly. She knew the protocol. No emotion, no panic. Just calm, firm commands. "You did good keeping an eye on it for me, but I need it back now." But it was as if Oba didn't even hear her. He kept his eyes squeezed shut and tried to cover his exposed ear with the elbow of the hand holding the arm cannon. "Too loud," he muttered. "Too loud." "Oba," Neve pleaded. "Quiet," Asala snapped. Neve obviously cared about Oba, and most likely felt responsible for him as a scientist on her team. But her distress wasn't doing the kid any good right now. "Let me talk to him. You just make sure Jude and the looter don't wake up and escalate things." Taking a slow, cautious step forward, Asala braced her body for action. If she could get Oba's attention, if she could keep him calm, he might let her get close. Then she could secure him and retrieve her weapon before anyone got hurt. I think it's going to be a rainy day, kid, she said, like they were discussing the planet's weather over a breakfast of dried meat and nutrient bars. The suns are almost up, but there's a lot of cloud cover. What do you reckon? Maybe I'll get to see that acid rain you were talking about? For a moment, it seemed like it had done the trick. Oba stilled, the hand over his ear lowering slowly to his side, and Asala made the mistake once again of allowing herself to hope. But when he opened his eyes, there was nothing but terror there. "It's in my head, Asala," he said. "Don't you see? It's in me, and there's only one way to get it out." Asala's heart lurched. She jerked forward. "No!" Gunfire. Neve's sharp, short cry. Then silence. Asala trembled with rage as she retrieved her arm cannon and covered Oba's shattered skull. She burrowed into the rage, painted herself in it with thick, smearing strokes because it was so much easier than the grief she knew was hiding underneath. Oba had wanted adventure. He'd been excited about the fucking weather. He'd been happy. He'd reminded her of Nico. "Help me get Jude and the prisoner into the jeep," she said curtly to Neve, who knelt beside her. "There's only one place we're getting any answers, so let's get going." "Wait," Neve said quietly. "What's that?" In the pinkish dawn light, Oba's hand looked like it was covered in blood. But it wasn't. As Asala looked closer, she saw that his entire arm was covered in blooms of red mushrooms. Asala staggered back, reeling. Red mushrooms. Like the red fungus they'd cleaned off the jeep every day they'd been out on the road. Like the red moss all over their prisoner's back. That was when she saw it. The spongy, cushiony softness of the ground under their feet. It had looked like soft purple vegetation in faint starlight, and had been so lovely to walk on, but now in the light of day, Asala could see it for what it was. A sea of crimson. Their entire campsite was covered in lush, red mushroom-like moss. As she looked farther up the mountain track, she saw more of it, weaving in and out of the purples of the grass and trees. Understanding swept over her. The looter had been covered in the fungus, which meant he had been exposed to it far longer than they had. And the more exposed the rest of them had become, the more they had changed. It had been small things at first, like nightmares and panic attacks, and the red ash in her dreams. Had it been ash? Or had it been the fungus all along? But when they had come here, to the mountain spring the looter had pointed them to, this place that was covered in fungus, everything had escalated. Asala was no scientist, so she didn't pretend to understand how the fungus worked or how it seemed to be able to invade the hearts and minds of human beings. What she did know was that Oba was dead, and Jude had almost choked Neve to death, and both of those things were down to whatever the fungus had done to them. She also knew that the looter was involved, just as she had suspected from the start. And she knew that as they got closer to his camp, the amount of fungus around them had grown. What if the defectors' camp was the source of the fungus? What if it was an alien entity that could twist and control the people who came in contact with it? It would explain everything. Whatever the truth really was, Asala was sure of one thing. She now knew who, or rather what, her enemy was. She had come to this world in search of a future for herself and for her sister, and she knew now that that wouldn't be possible until she made this world safe for them. It was too late for Oba, but it wasn't too late for Dio or Neve or Asala. She would find the source of whatever monstrous thing had taken Oba's life, and she would destroy it. To think they'd called this world salvation. So much for that.
You're listening to The Vela Salvation by Sangu Mandana, starring Robin Miles. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm, listen away. The Vela Salvation is written by Ashley Poston, Maura Milan, Nicole Givens-Kurtz, and Sangu Mandana. It is produced by Rhoda Bilyeza and executive produced by Molly Barton. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.